Awesome. So first off, Cami, tell me about where you're from.
Well, I am from Denmark and I've been living there my whole life.
But I feel like I've started hearing more about Denmark when it comes to the discussions on the Nordic model, in general, immigration lately, because a lot of people have been pointing to the immigration in Europe, as well as just, I think, Denmark and Switzerland and the other really cold places that I never want to visit because they're too cold. They're all held up as these pinnacles of female empowerment. And I mean, you've lived there your whole life. Do you think that that stereotype of it being just a safe haven for feminists and women, do you think that's true?
I don't think it's true. Sure, in some aspects we are marginally better off than other women. Like, sure, like Danish men won't go about honor killing you, and they're very unlikely to tell you how to dress or act unless they're religious. And most of our population isn't religious, so that's not really an issue. But we still have men. Like men are still men regardless of where we are. Just because they do like take on more of the duties of parenting or caring for the household doesn't mean that they aren't still chauvinist. Like they still expect women to do more of the housework. They still blame us when we're sexually assaulted. They still commit high rates of domestic violence. Like, just because it's marginally better doesn't mean it's perfect, doesn't mean it's some kind of safe haven.
Are there any specific like issues that have been kind of overlooked because of that expectation that, well, they solved it when women's liberation is done, feminism won, and so therefore they stop paying attention to specific issues?
Yes, like, well, we have abortion rights, and until recently, it wasn't. It was up to until like the 14th week or something. Now it's up until the 22nd, I think. But that wasn't up for discussion because we have this idea of like feminism is done. We've done all we can. Like, you see men walk around with a stroller. Uh, we need nothing more. Mm, like, gender ideology hasn't really taken as off as much as it has in the US. Like, it isn't as bad as like in the US and the Great Britain, but it's coming, and they've like started creeping into our on our domains. Like the museum for a museum specifically for women has been changed for to be like also include trans women. Yeah. Um, in particular, it doesn't, like, there are things that get overlooked. Uh, like, um, the media can be particularly harsh and victim blaming to victims of sexual assault. Men were still terrified when we had the Me Too movement going. And that was also blamed as like some kind of cruel revenge from women, as in as if it wasn't just like us demanding some retribution or like some justice, but that's cruel and unusual punishment.
It's interesting how, like, the Me Too thing, a lot of guys were like, "Oh no, rape allegations, they might make them up and ruin my life." And even when men are proven to have raped women, their lives are rarely impacted. And it's interesting, especially in the context of that recent case with the woman whose husband had arranged for her to be raped, what was it, 70 times by strangers while she was sleeping?
Like, they don't have a count of how many times it has happened, but there are 92 suspects.
I just remember reading the case and hearing that the original arrest was for upskirting, for voyeurism. And that reminds me of just in general, if a lot of small crimes, especially sexual ones, lead up to bigger ones. It's an escalation, and it was really, honestly, just I can't understand how they didn't figure this out sooner, given her health issues, given how much, like, if she'd been to the gynecologist, the doctor, to face, the damage, she couldn't figure out where it was coming from. You think they put together some dots and think maybe she was being abused, but no, it took voyeurism for anyone to look into it, and thankfully they did. But it's interesting how a lot of sexual crimes, small ones, voyeurism, picture in Korea. You've been in Korea before. You know that they have that huge issue with voyeurism there.
Incredibly huge issue, and it's like the nth room the issue that happened a few years ago, and now there is a reoccurrence of something like that where the victims are forced to carve the word slave into their skin, and 12-year-old girls are forced to put things up their vaginas. It's a depravity, and it usually starts incredibly young. Like it's 9-year-olds, 11-year-olds watching porn, and like now other children abusing, like children abusing other children is no longer an indicator of them being abused themselves. It's just an indicator that they've been exposed to porn.
Do you know anything about how small level crimes are treated in Denmark, like voyeurism or groping or whatever? Are those type of crimes taken seriously and punished to a decent degree, or is it also overlooked as it is in many other countries?
I think we do tend to take it somewhat seriously. Most people, like in general, will be like, "Ah, it's not that bad. You just got groped. Jesus Christ, like get over it." But my former karate instructor started like teaching kids how to drive. And he was dragged into court because he was flirtatious and groped a few of his students. He got first put into like local court, and he dragged it all up to like national court because he kept appealing. Uh, he was uh, he was sent to prison for a bit, and then he received a fine, and then he can't have a school uh like before. He can't like teach anyone under a certain age. Like he can't run the club anymore because he's not allowed to have access to minors. His daughters have accused him of sexual abuse, and his son, yeah, he got busted for being in bed with a 13-year-old twice. And he also got fired from his job because he was very uh, forceful with his colleagues, female colleagues. So there is like, of course, there's laws, but even if you get punished, it's just a slap on the wrist because our system is mainly rehabilitative. Like it's more focused on getting you back into society and being a functioning member instead of like harsh punishments like in the US, where it's not really about rehabilitating people. It's more about punishment. Here you get maybe 3 to 5 months in prison for committing rape, or even if you commit murder, the harshest sentence we have is 16 years, because 16 years is life. Apparently, I don't really comprehend that. Genuinely, if you're a serial killer, you can um you can get life, but then we obviously don't want them back into society, so they get like a mental sentence. So they get sent to a mental institution, or a prison with more of a mental institution vibe, kind of. And then you just sit there. Like that's where you stay. That's where the guy who killed Kim Wall will be. Like
It feels like the justice system everywhere is just very ineffective, in part because there's a focus on either generating prisoners for free labor, as it is in the US with the private prison sentences and all that stuff, or in other parts of the world, they just don't seem to want to punish them harsh enough. There's this idea that you can fix certain people who do horrible things. And that always reminds me of the Junko Furuta case. Like, because it's the thing, it's not even, we hear about a case something like that every so often in the news cycle. It happens constantly. It's not a one-off thing. And in every one of these cases, the guys who do it, well, in the case of Junko Furuta, all the guys, they were minors, so they didn't get much time, and then they got released and proceeded to continue to hurt people. Instead of taking it seriously, like, it was with a lot of shooters, mass shooters in the US. A lot of them commit domestic violence before they end up going off and shooting a lot of people. But that's never taken seriously, and then they look back and go, how could we have stopped this? Well, maybe we should have put him down.
There are so many Exactly, there are so many warning signs that get written off as, like, just boys being boys or as, like, harmless, but they're not harmless, they're indicators of future utter depravity, like, serial killers start out bedwetting and hurting pets because they're the only ones they have access to who they're stronger than. Um, very, very bad, sexual predators start out in childhood upskirting their classmates or that kind of thing, like raping their classmates. Or it starts so early, and they get away with it because they're children. But children grow up to become adults, and like sealing their records and like allowing them not to be hindered by what they did in childhood just leaves society vulnerable. It leaves women and girls vulnerable. Like genuinely, I'm of the opinion that the 72 men, 92 men, in the French case should have their names be household names. Like just as well as everyone knows who the Kardashians are, people need to know who those men are. They need to have like a symbolic mark of Cain on their forehead so everyone knows just who they are in the room with. Like there should be no forgiveness for this kind of thing. Like if we can't have them publicly executed, guillotined, and removed from this earth, we need to have them basically highlighted as like, okay, that's a sexual predator right here. He can't work in this and this these and these industries. He can't be around children. He can't be alone in the room with women. Basically, he's gotta go live on an island somewhere to not be confronted with what he did every day of his life.
You know what's interesting about that is people like to argue that, oh, the sex register offender registry here in the U.S. They argue that it doesn't do anything, it doesn't help, it makes them less likely to join back in society. But the thing is, sex crimes are already very difficult to prosecute because, to be honest, I worked as a advocate at a rape shelter, and our job was just to support the women who came in there. You support them no matter what they want to do, but the process of getting a kit done, the process of having to be interrogated, because that's what it is, an interrogation, by the police, by nurses, by counselors, and then do that all in court for what, a 3% chance that he might go to prison? Because the people they stack in the juries, at least in the US, if a woman is considered a potential juror for a rape case and she's previously been raped, oh, she's too biased, can't be on the jury. But if a guy watches pornography, which makes men, anyone who watches it, view rape as less serious, view women in a worse way, totally not an issue, he can be on the jury. And I feel like the idea is like if you the sex registry prevents them from reintegrating, but it also makes it harder for them to get access to vulnerable populations.
Exactly, and the vulnerable people are usually 14-year-olds that they have access to 24/7 through media and like in the internet. Like at this point, if you've ever committed a sexual crime, even just been suspected of one, you shouldn't be allowed like most access to most of the internet. Like you should have one of those locked iPads that they have in prison where you can like maybe call your mom or that. That's it. Like you can order a thing from the store and you can call your mom. The end. Like they've lost the privilege of having access to the rest of the world. because they're using that access to hurt other people. I watch a lot of like predator hunters, and even the police are so thankful because it's a pandemic. It's an epidemic of sexual predators. They have, like, even if they want to, they have n- no ability to catch all of these sick people, and it's usually Chris Hansen usually talks about how he thinks there's like two kinds of predators. Like predators who would be predators no matter what. Like they're something is sick within them, and they feel the need to harm others to pleasure themselves. And then there are men who are the predators who are just committing crimes of opportunity. Like they're lonely, they don't realize what they've done, and they don't realize the seriousness of their crime because they've been watching porn since they were 13, and it's just an escalation of things that are normalized to them. And they don't realize, okay, well, they're on a slope a slope leading them into utter depravity. Like they start up with normal porn, and all of a sudden they're on the dark web watching fucking babies being molested.
And you know what's interesting is the very obvious sex division there too, when it comes to violence and how they're treated when it comes to punishments. I've noticed a couple different cases where a young girl had been prostituted, had been trafficked. She kills her trafficker or would-be John, and then she ends up getting life in prison. And these are 14, 15, 16-year-old girls.
It's usually black girls too. What was her name? I can't even remember her name. There are so many cases of them. It's not even funny that I can't even remember her name. But she killed her trafficker, and then she gets, what, 20 years in prison. I'm sorry, she should get a Medal of Honor. The mayor herself needs to go and like put it on her throat and say thank you thank you for saving so many other victims. Thank you for killing off the scourge. Like genuinely, that's what I think. And this is why we have like this uptick of like vigilantism. Recently there's been a lot of furore about predator hunters in Denmark, because they would like pose as teens, and then they would lure the predator into the woods, and then they would beat him for 25 minutes. And the rule was no weapons, and he needs to be able to walk away from the place. But they would film it, they would beat the shit out of him, and then they would let him leave. And people, like, someone got sentenced for it recently because he got busted, but everyone is just in agreement. Yeah, well, if that's what it takes, if they need to be afraid that if to not show up, then fine. Like genuinely, if Chris Hansen's To Catch a Predator just ended with them just killing them off, that would also be fine.
I wish we had that option in more places where you're allowed to just, okay, you thought you were coming here to diddle a 13-year-old, you're gonna get your ass beat. That would be great.
Yeah. Or it needs to be so much of a social shame, so much of a blight on you that you do what that Texan DA did and like commit.
You know, that kind of brings me to, like, the benevolent sexism of, like, men are protectors, because the thing is there are good guys out there, I know that, and we're all flawed in different ways, like, the people have biases, whatever. But the problem is that a lot of guys' support of feminism or women kind of stops at when it would inconvenience them when they're around a male audience. So when guys are talking, locker room talk about women, oh, I'm going to do this and that to her, they're not standing up and saying anything then. Or maybe he doesn't take part in the gang rape, but he doesn't say anything or stop them either. Like,
Like they oppose it uh in our presence, but in the presence of their mates, they say nothing because that loses them social credit. That makes them like that makes them traitors of their own sex in some kind of way. But like, why would you want to be comrades? Why would you want to be mates and buddies with people who are literally undeserving of life? I don't understand it, and this is also why I have a bone deep distrust of men. Like men start out guilty, in my opinion, and then they gotta earn my trust, and they are so quick to lose it too. Like a wrong sentence, and I'm like, okay, you're not trustworthy.
I think it's also interesting in context of the other debates on equality and intersectionalism and whatnot, where for the past 10, 15, 20 years even, there's been this push all around the world, especially in academia, to acknowledge, okay, these people are oppressed for their race, for their sexuality, for this, for that. And the thing is, it started out with good intentions. I mean, Kimberly Crenshaw was speaking about how being a black woman is different than just being black or just being a woman. But you know, she started out with a very down to earth, very obvious, pay attention to the needs of this group, and now it's being used as you can't talk. It's about this, that, or the third. It's a gag order because to call out misogyny, it's almost always misogyny. Calling out misogyny is considered bad because if a minority does it in some way, shape, or form, then you're implying that minority is bad. I feel like it's like a child talking to a child about these kind of topics.
Yeah, there there was that Twitter post of a woman being like, of a white woman criticizing the Taliban, and this man just said, "There's something about a white woman criticizing the sovereignty of a brown nation. It doesn't sit right with me." And she's like, "Bro, it's a Taliban." Like, they're so what if they're brown men? They're literally dictators and and terrorists. Like, I'm why would them being brown in their own country where they are the bosses, where they have all the power, why would their brown skin give them any kind of protection or excuse from criticism? Like that's absurd. I also really feel bad for Crenshaw for how her theory and has been utterly utterly abused and like just taken completely out of context.
For me, I think it's the interpretation of cultural relativism as meaning that oppression is fine if it's part of the culture. And instead of, to be honest, I do think that there's a universal set of values, and that is don't hurt other people. It's a very simple concept.
There are human rights and there are moral rules, and those are not subject to cultural relativism. There's cultural relativism counts when it's like how you dress or what kind of food you eat. It does not have any effect on human rights. Everyone's rights are the same regardless of what culture they come from.
But it seems like the universal form of oppression is misogyny. Every culture has found some way to oppress women because of their sex. And so it's background noise to most people to where they don't even want to address the fact that misogyny is literally everywhere. From, like we said, in Korea with the nth room, and they have so many issues with the internet in particular and technology. But
And also so much femicide is like never labeled as like a hate crime even though it is. Like it obviously it is. But no one will will like call it what it is and like prosecute it for what it is. It's not just a matter of one citizen killing another. There's a culture of it, and obviously that needs to be prosecuted and punished.
if we record every act of femicide as femicide, it massively overshows any other type of hate crime. And I think for most women, acknowledging just how gendered violence is, the number one leading cause of death for pregnant women, at least in the US, is murder. If we talk about these things, it's scary, and no one likes to admit that the monster could be in the house. And the thing is, it's not even. I don't even like to call them monsters because that implies that they are somehow not human or above being human or something. No, these are just average men. They're just men. They're flesh and bones like everyone else.
It's hard to acknowledge that every day you come home to what is basically a predator living in your house. Like every day you come home from your work day, you're kicking off your shoes, you walk past your beloved children, and you give the person most likely to murder you and your children a kiss on the cheek, and then you go cook him dinner. Like how are you supposed to acknowledge that? It's so incongruent because we're fed the story of how life should be from childhood. Like genuinely, it starts so early with like Disney movies and fairy tale stories of how important love is and how our lives will basically peak with marriage, and the most important thing we'll ever do as women, as girls, is fall in love and get married and have children. And it even continues into teenage years where you're reading YA, and then you become an adult and you read uh, Daniel Steele and such things because the lie has to be perpetuated, and now society has created a need in you that relationships with men fundamentally cannot fulfill. So you have to find that emotional satisfaction and that fulfillment of the dream that we've been fed since childhood in stories, in fictional stories and romance novels that we are well aware have nothing to do with like reality. But we have to keep on this idyllic image. We have to create this idyllic image of the happy family with the picket fence and the dog and the house, and but it's a lie.
It's so difficult to conceptualize how deeply some men hate women, and there are some who just have that benevolent sexism where it's just, oh, women are the fairer sex, they're weaker, they're better for this or that, and it is with good intentions. And I think a lot of women can agree with that. I'm actually doing some reading on that now, and depending if it's from a romantic partner, a lot of women will accept like benevolent sexism because it's supposed to be coming from a place of protection, paternalism. It can be a little annoying, but they don't view it as dangerous. But then there's the fact that like there are chat rooms and there are books and there are groups and there's all these different little men's spaces where they do talk about women in horrible, disgusting ways, and the hatred of women is palpable. It's like it's thick in the air. It's not just, oh, women aren't so suited for heavy work. I'll help her carry in the groceries. It's I want to screw teenage girls and decapitate them and do these awful, awful things. And I don't think a lot of women understand or have come to terms with the fact that there are Facebook groups and Telegram channels where men are exchanging nudes and sex tapes of their girlfriends without their knowledge. There are in Japan, they currently have that deepfake thing where they're going along creating deepfake pornography of school students. You've got the nth room, and you know more about the Korean crime, so actually go ahead and tell me about because Korea is a very good example of the I hate women type of misogyny.
It is because they're raised in okay, so Korea evolved really quickly, like technologically and like financially, like way too quickly. Society basically never had the chance to progress slowly it in accordance with the technological advancement of society. So they have like all the luxuries of the modern world, but basically they're only just a few years out of what is basically the Joseon era, where they're following Confucianism and women aren't allowed to leave the house, and when they have to leave the house, they should cover their heads, and like women are the earth and men hold up the sky, that kind of thing, and all of and sons are like there is so much sexism it just burned into Korean society that I hardly know where to start. When you get married, you have to start taking care of like creating altars for your husband's family members and ancestors. You have to remember their birth dates and all of the important days. You have to spend several days cooking to prepare for the ceremonies, and all of this is your responsibility. You have to do all the work, but are you allowed to bow down in front of the altar to those ancestors? No. You are a servant doing all the work. And like it's no wonder that women don't want to get married. Like they literally get nothing out of it. They get punished by the work market for getting married because like if you're married, soon children will follow, and if you have children, you're not as effective a worker, and people don't want to deal with like an employee or a colleague who are constantly in and out of work because they're getting pregnant or they have to give birth, and then they have to spend time away from work to raise that child, then they come back. But it's similarly an issue for wives who or and mothers who are now basically without any support or any way out from the domestic sphere. Like they're stuck because they can't go out and find work. Now they've spent the last 15 years raising a child, and now he or she is finally independent, and you can go back and like restart your career, and but you've lost 15 years of not being in the industry, of not being updated on all the things that your profession has advanced in, that you haven't kept up with your education with like your college education is outdated, so much has changed, and basically you've crippled yourself. Like what do you get out of getting married and having a child and like not being able to earn money because now you're dependent on your husband who earns so much more than you already, and you're just stuck as his domestic servant for the rest of your life because you did what society told you that you should, and now they're punishing you for following orders. Like even the way Christian Kim Ji Young, yeah, yeah, that was an eye opener indeed. It basically created like this wave of the feminist movement in South Korea because so many saw themselves and their mothers in it, like themselves and their mothers and even their grandmothers. They saw themselves in Kim Ji Young, and they didn't want it for themselves. And so Korean women have gone so far as to like swear off men entirely, swear off dating them, swear off having sex with them, swear off marrying them, swear off children, like even n- like not buying from companies that despise like the 4B movement. I have so much respect for it. I joined it myself. I would rather consider myself 4B than radical at this moment because like the Western radical movement has no teeth. They are creating actual change. They have made such an impact on the birth rates just by defying the government begging for them to get married and have children. Like they put so much media out to entice women with like the idyllic idea of romance. Like K-dramas are rave right now. Everyone is watching K-dramas regardless of where you are in the world because it's so romantic. It's beautiful, but it's a lie. No Korean man is like that.
Isn't it interesting that a lot of the most misogynistic societies for women have this fascination with romance? Because Indian movies, Bollywood movies, also tend to have that focus on romance and how wonderful it is. but it's not exactly great for women in India with the amount of violence that they're at risk of. And the same thing goes for Korea, where, oh my gosh, semen terrorism and spy cams in bathrooms. Those are two of the things that I thought of when I was considering teaching there. And last minute, I was talking to a friend of a friend who was like a American blonde girl, and if she had a hard time there, I was like, oh shit, nope, not for me.
I was incredibly lucky. I worked for a well-off family. I didn't have to get into like the education system or like a proper company culture, and like being around the wealthy meant I was basically spared a lot of what other immigrants or like expats are subject to in South Korea. Like I could just I could, but even then, being as sheltered as I was, I still almost got kidnapped in a taxi and had to call my boss and be like, I think he's taking me somewhere I shouldn't be going. And like uh, a taxi driver would stop the car so I could come sit up front, and then he'd like try to hold my hand, and he would ask me all these very invasive questions, and I'd be like, "Don't you have a wife? Aren't you married? Don't you have children?" And he'd be, "Yeah, sure." And this action of like preying on someone who is 21 years old, obviously very young, doesn't like rock his worldview or make him feel bad in any way whatsoever. Like preying on women, having access to women sexually and just in general, they take it so much for granted. Someone in a club, one of the very well off, in one of the very well off parts of Korea. I was partying in Gangnam, I think, up in Apgujeong. A man in a suit basically just came, took my hand, and tried to bring me to a hotel or to his car. Like either was fine, and he thought that because I was a white girl, he could just bring me away. It's very odd, and I was just like, I don't know you. Why the fuck do you think I would go away with you? You could bring me somewhere I don't know, try to murder me. Why would I want to leave with you? And they have a term for riding the white horse, like getting with a white girl, because they think we're so easy, sexually
I've
available.
heard that, especially with teaching in Japan and Korea, that like they assume foreign women are easy, and there's like special ways they bring it up. Like they'll be like, "Do you live alone?" and ask the questions in a
Mm,
very roundabout way to see. And
yeah.
to be honest, this kind of illustrates. There's also sort of this belief that, like, for example, Japan and Korea, but I know more about Japan. Is like a super polite society, super violent free, super great place, and of course that's because if you scratch below the surface just a little bit, well, Japan has a huge history of really graphic, horrible violence. People
Yes.
don't talk about the comfort women or the rape of Nanking nearly enough.
They
And even
refuse
today,
to acknowledge it. They won't even put it in their history books. It's a footnote. They refuse to put it in their. They're dragging it out. Like they've been sanctioned by the UN several times for not like redressing the issue of comfort women, and they're refusing to acknowledge it. I that they're waiting it out until the last of the comfort women die out, and then they can just like brush it off and not pay restitution. It's like even just setting up those comfort women statues in front of the Japanese embassy in South Korea created such an outrage with like Japanese people and like the politicians. They basically just shut off all the political dealings for a while because they were so furious. But it's a matter of historical record. We all know what they did. We all globally know what they did. They can't just pretend. But because they have like reframed themselves with like anime and cute clothes and I don't know, they had so much soft power that they've basically erased their absolutely evil, demonic crimes against humanity. Like I wrote a book about evil in seventh grade or something, and they were talking about the experiments that were done by the Japanese during the war. Bro. And I'm like, okay, sure. I I had a fascination with Japan at that time. Like I loved like my little anime things and things. After that, I loved watching historical Japanese dramas. After that, I was so shook by what they'd done, by their history. I couldn't look at it the same way, and I still can't. Like, sure, Japanese history pre Second World War is interesting, but I don't want to engage with it because it repulses me so much. Like, I don't even really want to go to Japan. There are places in Japan I'd like to see, fair, but I don't want to go. There's an incongruence there because they have this image, this idyllic image of well groomed and polite, and then there's just absolute all the shitty things they won't acknowledge and won't treat. Like just hiding shit won't change society. Being allowed to just sweep it under the rug just perpetuates it.
I feel like acknowledging that when there are restrictions lifted, like when the the cage of societal rule of the shame of your family and friends knowing when all that's gone, when there's wartime, men use that as an excuse to commit atrocities. And I've did a lot of reading this summer on war. I was trying to figure out women in war, and I was reading about the conflict in Bangladesh. And you know what happened when there was conflict? Boom, there was massive systemic rape. When Japan was invading China, well, not only was there a huge role of dehumanization, because despite being pretty ethnically similar, it was easier. Once you dehumanize someone, it makes it easier to excuse what you do to them. And what they did on the way to Nanking and in Nanking is genuinely just very, very disturbing to the point where I've been trying for months to figure out how to discuss it on the channel without getting an issue. And then you see it in the Rwandan genocide. You see it in any war zone going on right now. And it all brings to the same conclusion that it's not, you know, this kind of man or this kind of man. It's pretty much all men. And when it comes down to what crimes come down to, it's all men, because what it comes down to is do they have the desire, the opportunity, and the ability? And when those three things happen, the answer tends to be a resounding sexual assault.
Yes, yes. Look, in the war, women and children become proxy for the country. Like they become like a symbolic, uh, a symbol of said country. So a man raping a woman or a child and then murdering her after is like a microcosm of how they want to treat the country, how they want to bring that down. Like it's like it's almost poetic in how cruel and how symbolic it is. Um, I don't. I generally don't trust. Like as I said before, I don't trust a single man because given the opportunity, you never know what they're gonna do. Like you can never know what hides beneath the surface. Everyone keeps saying that psychopaths are super charming and like really intelligent and such. They're not. They're not. They just have this goodwill. They take advantage of the goodwill of others. Like there's an expectation that people I'm a decent person. I wouldn't do such a thing. So neither would people around me. But we as women can't have that naivety. Like we have to expect the worst from everyone around us to be able to protect ourselves. That's like we have to look at everyone with suspicion. That's horrifying.
I was really interested in wondering. So, I'm not as caught up on events that are outside of the US, UK, and Australia, because that's where a lot of the news comes out. Unless there's some kind of very, very awful crime, I'm not as caught up with law and whatnot. But I do know that right now, across all of Europe, there's a rising sentiment of anti-immigration that some people are labeling as inherently racist. Now, as someone who does not live in Europe anymore, I feel like I'm not exactly equipped to discuss that topic because I'm not living in the exact environment, and I've learned very well that the news is not always accurate. They report what they want to report, and they often report on men as being female. So can't even trust the news sources to accurately describe what it's like to actually live there in this experience. In your experience, what are you experiencing now with I've said experience like 5 times in the past minute. How are you how is it living in Denmark with this kind of rising sentiment? As you're a radical feminist, probably as radical as they come. So I trust that you understand the intersection of being female and coming from a developing country or war zone. But a lot of the focus has been on primarily the men and primarily quote unquote brown men. So let me hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, so basically, overall, I think that immigration is a social positive and like a necessary part of the progress of society. Multiculturalism is a positive for society. Who doesn't love being able to walk down the street and decide whether you want kebab or sushi or the Indian spot for once? We all love that, but the issue with immigration is that there is an incongruence when some cultures meet, because a very very conservative people coming from a very very conservative culture and entering a very very progressive culture, they don't know how to adapt to the country they're in. They start viewing the women of the culture especially as filthy or easy, and they despise us for not being like their women. Um, it was one of the big, like, generally I have no issue with female immigrants. Female immigrants are always a positive. Like they come here and they bring so much positive energy, and they participate in like society, and they do so much good work, especially in care, and like there's nothing there. But there are so many issues with immigration when it comes to the men, because the men refuse to integrate. The men come here and think they can act like how they could back at home, and they can't. Like that's why we had the incident at Cologne. That's why they have such high rates of criminal behavior. But the issue isn't even like the first generation immigrants, because they come from war zones. They are aware of why they've fled, and they are thankful of being safe, if nothing else. If nothing else, they are thankful for being safe and in a country where they don't have to look over their shoulder. Of course they would rather be at home. If it was up to them, they would rather be at home, but they've been forced to come here. And they are grateful for safety at least. But their children, the second generation, the third generation immigrants, they don't feel welcome. A lot of them, especially the boys, they don't feel welcome here, and that creates like this animosity. They don't like how girls are just as free to play around as boys. They don't act like white boys. They don't act like the boys from our country, and that is the I think that is why us pointing out is what gets us labeled racist, I think. But it's not a matter of
So basically, it's like the the not
Yes.
integrating. Like in the US, we're called like the melting pot because a lot of cultures come. And the thing is, like, in my home state of Georgia, there's a lot of immigrant communities. There's like a lot of Mexican restaurant, Hispanic restaurants, stores. There's like a Koreatown type
We
area,
have none of
but
that.
those areas are not hostile to anybody coming. Like I lived in that area, no one was hostile. They were glad to have the customer. They still made an effort to learn English for the sake of communication. I obviously have lived in many foreign countries, and trying to fit in goes a long way to being accepted in a
Completely.
community. Going to events, trying to meet people, but if you're not trying to integrate, especially through the second
No.
generation, and in the US, like the second generation, their parents are pushing them to go to school. They need them to know English to translate. They might still have, like Hispanic neighborhoods or restaurants, but they still consider themselves American.
Yes, and that is the issue. They're not doing that. They all move into the same neighborhood. They live together, and those neighborhoods usually become very insulated. Like I know it's like not socially acceptable to do so, but they get called ghettos because they have like this culture of violence. My best friend is originally or her, yeah, their family is original Palestinian, but they fled from Lebanon. They fled from Palestine to Lebanon, and then they fled from Lebanon to Denmark. And she doesn't visit her hometown because she doesn't wear hijab, and her family doesn't know that. So she can't go there for fear of violence. Like there's towns here that she can't enter because people know who her father was. People know who her family is, and they have a reputation of violence. She told me her cousin got her eyelids, like her eyebrows and her
Eyelashes?
eyelashes. There it was. She had those shaved off, and then she was sent back to Lebanon, and she was basically grounded or held hostage for half a month. And you know why? Because she got a Danish boyfriend. We have we have incidents of men killing their daughters, brothers killing their sisters for dating Danish men because the girls here like do what is expected when you come to another country to integrate. They do well at school. They do get their grades. They make friends with the with the indigenous population. They try to interact. They try to like become as everyone else. But the boys refuse to do so. The boys only stick with their own. The boys punish the girls for trying to fit in, and their husbands, fathers, and brothers physically if they become too Danish. And their society, their little microcosm societies keep them in place and keep them marrying into like you get to marry your cousin and no one else. Like that's the kind of culture. And the boys are just creating the boys they don't try to fit in, but they don't feel welcome either. So instead of that, instead of fostering community with our society, they create gangs, and get their sense of community from that. And they commit a lot of violence, a lot of drug dealing, running with weapons, a lot of fighting.
It's interesting because, like, you go to another country from a country that's developing or facing conflict, and you bring your family, and then your daughter sees, oh, I can have education. Oh, I can get a job. Oh, I can be independent and have, a male partner who, at the very least, is not going to be allowed to physically abuse them, and they'll have options to leave him if they want to. But instead of allowing a gradual acclimation to the new country you're at, they're holding them back, and obviously, these girls are seeing how misogynistic and how restricted their lives are from their own culture, and then seeing the freedom of the culture they've moved to, which ideally, if you move somewhere long term and you want to live there and be part of the country, you want to blend in, you want to be part of that culture. And it's interesting because I've seen that kind of story a lot. One of my friends, um, Marriott, she's Somali, And she talks quite often about how being in the US, not having her dad in the picture anymore because he died, is had allowed her to become a nurse, to date and eventually marry a white guy, to have have these opportunities that she wouldn't have otherwise. And when she comes across people in her community, just like sharing the same nation, I mean, then they always judge her and they so harshly for her choices and for not conforming. And it's always the women who tend to get the most punishment out of not conforming to the culture they've literally no they left from, the rules of the country they left from should no longer apply.
Of course, because women are like emblems uh, of the like they carry the honor of the father basically, and that's why if they trespass against what the father or the brother considers proper, they feel entitled to kill her because he's shamed. Now she's shamed their entire family and him, and his, like put a blight on his reputation. And it's stupid because you don't go to a country and then refuse to learn the language and just live there and think you can live like how you did at home. Like that's insane behavior. Like, but that's what they're doing. We have women who've lived here for 27 years and don't know a word of English because they never leave the house and they only speak with like their sisters-in-law and their daughters and their cousins. Those are the only people they ever get to socialize with. Like that's sad. That's terrible. Like a lot of like very conservative old people are like, you can't live in a place and not learn the language. Like that is the benchmark for becoming Danish to a lot of people, like knowing the language.
I've heard similar for Japan. Basically, you have to, if you speak Japanese, you'll be accepted to a certain extent. And to be fair, learning a language is hard. I feel like learning English is one of the easier ones because there's so many resources. But I've noticed, for example, here, I'm taking language lessons to learn Khmer, and I'm awful at learning languages. I feel really embarrassed trying to practice. I have a lot of sympathy for other people who have English as a second language because I know how difficult it is to learn something at an older age like that. But because I've made the effort, well, because I've made the effort, Khmer is so hard. The last one I tried to learn was Hungarian, and that was awful too. But when you learn a couple words and you make the effort, it goes so far to being accepted in the community. Now that I can speak a little bit, and now that I can speak just a little bit, I can talk to there's a fruit cart lady who lives right outside of my apartment gate. I say hello to her every day, and when I come home with like vegetables or something, I'll be like, "Knyong jong din bon lai," and she'll be like, well, "Yeah, vegetables." And it's a very small interaction,
They think
but
they think we're so adorable for trying. I spent 5 months in Korea, and I can basically speak fluently because I got so much positive feedback everywhere. People were like, "You know Korean? You speak Korean?" And like, especially the older generations would like praise you and give you gifts or free fruit for even just knowing basic words. Like just being at a food stand and saying properly, "Thank you for the food." Someone like peek their head out and be like, "Wasn't that a foreigner? Was that a foreigner?" Because they're shook that someone is trying so hard to fit in and like learn the language. We as Danish people prefer people seem to prefer to that people don't learn because it's hard. We know Danish is super hard to learn, and we're very quick to switch over to English to be accommodating. But we think so highly of you for trying, even if we don't really like how it sounds.
and see, that's the thing that I've realized traveling around so much is that people just appreciate the effort of trying to fit in and trying new things. My coworkers will try to give me new fruit whenever they have so much fruit. I don't know where all the fruit comes from and what the situation is. But for some reason there's always like fruit at work and they'll be like, try this and then I always go, what is it? And they laugh because like they don't know the English name, just the Khmer one. And I can say like five Khmer fruits. I cannot say the complicated ones. But there's such a interest in getting to know each other and an acceptance of wow, you're really trying. And I think that and a lot of especially with the expat community here, I've noted there's a difference. People will say like people from Western countries, Australia, US, Canada, what have you, are expats. Typically because we are bringing in business and we're in higher paid jobs, so they don't mind us as much. And then if you are going the other way, coming from a lower income or brown or Asian country, they call you an immigrant. But either way, I've noticed that there's an insularness in the expat community as well. A lot of people who have lived here for 5, 10, 15 years only hang out in certain bars with certain people. They might know some Khmer and some Khmer people, but they haven't made an effort to really, really dig in and get to know anyone. But that is kind of accepted though, because the type of trouble that Westerners bring here is very predictable. It's typically ran out on bar tab or didn't pay bar girl. So I feel like there's not that same kind of animosity towards immigrants coming to here, to Cambodia, because there's an expectation of you brought money. If you're a white guy, you probably came here to buy a wife or a girlfriend, but at least you have money. There's not really an expectation of foreigners committing acts of violence. And I think that it's like the news cycle. When you see it in the news all the time, you start to expect it. It's pattern recognition. The same way that I don't blame any woman for seeing all the man did horrible thing to woman and then being cautious around men. No one, it's very obvious pattern recognition. That's, and I understand the same thing when it comes to immigration because people will notice the part in the headlines, and this is the big part of the way that the news reports it, of immigrant man or illegal foreigner or whatever commits crime.
Well, they did. It's just human nature to do so. Actually, they did this study of telling of coming with all these telling the members of the study all these acts, crimes done by black people, and they show them all these articles and such, and then they show pictures of black people. Then they show them pictures of like from all demographics, and the people, and then they ask them afterwards which of the faces were most hostile, and they will choose the black faces every time because they just been inundated with data and like bad of them being hostile and violent and scary. We take on an expectation when we get all of this information of things that are done badly by people and like bad things done, and we just we're colored, we get biased really quickly. But that's the whole point of like of tribal behavior and tribal mindsets. That's just part of our instinct. It's primal behavior. That's how our ancestors stayed alive. That's how they were safe. So it's just human nature. Like it isn't malicious or cruel on purpose. It's just how we act. Like you're not intentionally trying to be racist. You just have instincts from the primal world that kept our ancestors safe,
And I think there's a
basically.
big difference between associating and I don't think there's a difference between seeing an association and letting it influence how you treat or talk about a group. For example,
Oh, definitely.
like a lot of people, and people do this anyway with, it's just human nature to say things like, and not think it through. And a lot of people don't necessarily mean to be malicious about it. Like my mother in the US, for example, there's always this racial tension with Hispanic or Mexican people. And it's like, oh, they're hard workers and they're great at outside labor. And it's not like it's an intentionally cruel or mean thing to say. It's the stereotype that's
But
consistently.
it's like a benevolent racism.
Yes. It's because everybody who works in, my mom does a lot of handwork, a lot of projects. When she goes to Home Depot, the majority of guys there are like Hispanic because they do a lot of work crews. You can get Hispanic laborers in the parking lot, and it's not necessarily I think Hispanic people are only good at construction. That's where the issue comes in. And the same thing goes kind of for immigration and discussing policies. It's not all brown men are inherently more likely to commit crimes and they're awful people. It's a lot of immigrants are coming from countries that have um, a culture
Culture
that
in which
allows
that
for,
behavior is acceptable.
yeah,
Yeah.
and pointing that
Like,
out,
it is nothing inborn or inherent in them. They just come from a culture where they are raised to be allowed to do such things.
yes, and
Like,
that also offers the
all men
solution of,
would do the same thing if they were raised like that, regardless of skin color. If a white man was raised like they were in, I don't know, fucking Somalia, they would act like they do in Somalia. Like,
yeah.
that's just
And of course, acknowledging that it's a socialization issue means that it's a problem that can be addressed socially. I hate the idea that men are just inherently born awful and evil and prone to sexual violence. I don't think that's the case. I don't like the idea that half the population is inherently bad and more predisposed to do bad things. If it's a social problem, then at the very least we can try to address it. I know how nurture and nature works. I'm sure there are some biological components that lead to differences in behavior. But when we at least point it out as men are socialized to think that women's lives are worth less, well, at least we can try to work on policies and socialization to address that, and we can be aware of the role that socialization, that background, that culture and experience plays when we're deciding on risk taking. Like, to be honest, like if I go out to a music show and I'm coming home and drunk, okay, I'm gonna want to make a judgment on who to go home with, or how to call a cab or whatever, and be safe about it. You want to be able to make decisions and take risks to minimize the harm to yourself and to your fellow women.
I love you.
All right, well, it is midnight on my end, and I have to drag my ass out of bed. It's 7 tomorrow.
Goodness, we've also been talking for a very long time. Anyways, I'll let you get to bed.